Welcome to Folk Cries Rooted, a bi-weekly podcast interwoven with folk music, which explores the potentials of climate action in our communities. I'm your host, Jemima Gleave, and for this week's episode I interviewed Alzein, founder of Bees and Refugees, an organisation which teaches the craft of beekeeping as a therapeutic intervention with refugees, asylum seekers and the wider community. This is the first of 2 episodes featuring Ali, which were recorded in Oasis Garden in Waterloo. It was a bit noisy there, so please excuse any disruptions. As a special feature for Refugee Week, at the end of this episode I will discuss some of the research I conducted about borders during my university studies in anthropology. I'd also like to offer a potential trigger warning, as Ali lightly touches on his experience of torture at the hands of Assad's regime in Syria, and I play some chants from protests during the 2011 Syrian uprising. If you would like to know the names of any of the tracks that I play during this episode, please have a look at the information written underneath the Instagram post.
I'm losing willow. My hands are soft as cotton gloves. Machine has eaten up my job, my meaning, my cause. Machine with the strength of 100 men can't feed and clothe my children, can't greet a sailor coming in, or know of desperation. I shovel coal down Spencer's dock. I took a deer into wedlock, and you did a bear as a beautiful flock. We've rocked the machine down on the docks. We've rocked the machine until it stops. Oh Lord, if you show me gold, like a heron I will go. Oh, Robin, and lift me when you're high, like a comrade I will die, and the gold will glow and I will rise. We're gold enough to win back time. We're gold enough to win back pride. River rock the machine until it dies. Today, dear, I am unemployed. Before I spoke, you read my eyes. I feared of nothing or no one, but I feel old and I'm so young. I miss the graft, I miss the boys. I plead for purpose in the void. Time is in a word ticking tighter. I wish my Lord was a mountain lighter. I shovel coal down Spencer's dock. We've rocked the machine until it stops. Oh Lord, if you show me gold, We're gold enough to win back pride. River rock the machine until it dies. River rock the machine down on the docks. River rock the machine until it stops.
I'm here in Oasis Garden in Waterloo, and I'm joined by Ali Alzein, who is the founder of Bees and Refugees, which is an environmental and social organisation working with beekeeping and refugees in London. So yeah, to start this conversation, I'm just gonna ask Ali and also say myself 3 things that we're both grateful for today. I am grateful for Ali meeting me and allowing me to trial my podcasting skills with him. I'm grateful for the train getting me here on time, just about. And also I'm grateful for the bees for doing such amazing work, keeping us all alive and all the flowers pollinated.
My name's Ali Alzein. I come from Syria, from the capital, Damascus. I've been in London since 2014, and I used to work in the fashion industry, and I'm very grateful that I'm no longer working in the fashion industry. So the first thing I'm very grateful for is the fact that I'm working on this project. I'm working with nature. I'm working with the bees. That's such a privilege. So this is something I'm very grateful for. The fashion industry is behind me now.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I'm very grateful for is the network, like the friends that I made in London. So I haven't been able to be with my family for over 10 years because of borders and the war in Syria and what happened and whatnot, like all these complications. But luckily I have made a family here. I have amazing friends who became like my brothers and sisters. So very grateful for having them. And what else? I'm grateful that it's not raining and it's quite warm today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm grateful for that too.
Yeah, luckily it's not raining, so that's good enough for London.
Yeah. Can you just explain a little bit about what the organisation is that you started and what sort of work you've been doing?
Yes, of course. So I started Bees and Refugees back in January 2020. After discovering how therapeutic it is to work with the bees. So in 2019, I got one beehive. I brought one beehive and I placed it in my garden. After my grandfather advised me to keep bees again, he was the one who actually taught me beekeeping back home. So I was once talking to him, telling him how stressed I was and how that I was struggling a bit with my mental health. So he advised me to keep. He was like, "Yeah, get a beehive. They'll entertain you. The bees will keep you happy." That's all he said, and then he passed away shortly after that.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think that the first day when I was introducing the bees to my garden, I felt a sense of peace that I haven't felt in so long. So, and then I think shortly after I realized that this is actually like I've always asked myself, what's my purpose? What am I doing in my life? Like what am I passionate about? Like, and I was working before in the fashion industry, and it was exhausting. It was like I liked the artistic side of it, but like it was still, I felt like I'm part of a system that's exploiting the planet. So yeah, finding like a sense of purpose in beekeeping was like the first thing that I kind of felt, and then reading, like I think at that time in 2019 there was a huge pushback for refugees crossing. There was the fortress of Europe when they were like pushing refugees back in Poland and in so many other countries, and actually like attacking them while they're trying to escape war. So I was really in a low point in my life where I was struggling a lot with my mental health, and I think and I wanted to do. I was a bit kind of I don't know how to explain this. Like I was kind of losing hope. And then when I started keeping bees and I read about the native black bees and how endangered they are as well, and at the same time that was happening to refugees at like the pushback. That's when the name bees and refugees, I think the first thing that came to my mind was the name, like bees and refugees, and I was just thinking about bees and refugees, both struggling, both really suffering, and because of the hostile environment around them. So I think when the name came to my mind, it was the day when the organization was born, or like the project was born. So we started crowdfunding. When I say we, because as soon as I had the idea and it was in my head, anyone that I was telling them about my idea, everyone was getting so excited about it, and everyone was saying like, yes, do it, like this sounds so amazing. It will probably help so many other people. If it's helping you, it will help others. And that's how the whole project was born. It became like it's so light after so many volunteers, friends of mine and so many other volunteers became part of it because they believed in it. So more or less 200 people were engaged in this project in the last 2 years. And we established like the project in the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic, at the very beginning of it, which was also an achievement to be like active and like support the community during that very challenging time, especially at the first year of the pandemic when everyone was like so low and like feeling down. So we kind of crowdfunded for the equipment that we needed and for the bees, and we started knocking on every door to potentially find locations to place beehives at. Oasis Farm. This farm was one of the first sites that I contacted, and I asked them if they're interested in having bees on the farm, and they were very welcoming. They were very excited about having bees here, and this was one of our first partnerships. So we placed a few hives here, and we started offering workshops to their community. So this farm supports the local community in Waterloo, and it supports different communities across London. Usually they invite a group of students that are on the edge of being expelled from school for like behavior issues, or like students who are not performing, and they need or like students that come from a very difficult background and they never had access to green space. They've never had the privilege to be in a space like this one. So so this was our first partnership, which is something I'm very proud of, and it continued until today. We've been offering, I think we've helped 400 students and refugees and asylum seekers in the last 2 years. 2019. I was
2019.
living back then. I was living in Hammersmith, and I had a very nice, like a one-bedroom apartment with a very nice garden. Before placing the hives, I was always growing my own herbs and like veggies in the gardens, and like the year I introduced the bees, the harvest was like tripled. So I had a
Really?
a lot more much bigger harvest. The bees, they're cross-pollinating. They're pollinating all your plants. Like every flower that's in your garden definitely will get pollinated, and it will become a fruit.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wow, okay. And were your neighbours okay with you having a beehive in your garden? Or did they not know?
No, they actually no. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't easy to hide. You cannot hide your bees, especially at some point. I think I had 20 beehives in my garden. Like the day we introduced the bees to the sites in London, all the hives came to my place first. They were in my garden, sitting there for like a few days. Then we moved them to. We distributed them in different sites.
Okay.
Neighbors were very excited to have bees, and I kind of sweetened them up with a bit of honey.
Yeah.
So I gave them
always
honey.
good.
They were very excited about it. They didn't mind at all.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
We've had no complaints in 2 years, like zero complaints. No one gets stung, because also we make sure that the bees are happy. So we're not exploiting the bees. We're not making the bees upset by taking their honey. So it's also the relationship we have with the bees is very. There is a balance like within the relationship. So.
Okay, so do bees sting more if you're stealing their honey?
Absolutely, yeah. If you're taking more honey than you should, and the bees will have to like work harder, and they become edgy. And
Fair enough.
Yeah. It's they're right.
Okay, so how do you balance that then?
The first 2 or 3 years we don't take any honey, and then we have to estimate. We have to always evaluate like how much honey the bees have, how big the colony is. So there is no rule. We cannot say that here is a rule you can follow. No, you have to always make sure that the bees will have enough time. Even if we take some honey, that the bees will have enough time to compensate and like refill what we've taken.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't know.
So it's kind of specific to the hive and
Very specific to the hive, to the how big the hive is, the seasons, the weather, how much time the bees they still have before winter. So many factors. So the important thing is always to leave, like for the first 2 years, not taking any honey. So until the colony is very well established and is strong.
Okay. And do you think then in that case that it's actually feasible that you could have a sort of sustainable commercial honey production?
I mean, we're steering away from any commercial honey production operation. Like we don't want to be linked to honey production, because if you wanna, it's not. You'll have to exploit the bees if you wanna make commercial amounts, like big amounts.
Yeah.
You have to do what other beekeepers do, which is feeding sugar water and exploiting the bees and taking more honey than. We're not gonna do that. We're actually making money from doing the workshops which is offering therapy, which is using the therapeutic element of being around bees instead of taking their honey. So like we're compensating in that way.
Yeah. So for you, the honey isn't really making you that much money.
It's actually just like an extra. It's like the honey is the cherry on top of the ice cream.
Yeah.
And it's something that we can share with the community. Something we can share. Like it's actually most of our honey gets distributed to like refugees, asylum seekers, students, kids, like the local community. So.
Okay. So do you think then, not just for you, but in terms of the actual honey production industry, do you think that it could ever be sustainable to produce honey on a large scale?
There is no way to like make. I mean, our consumption of everything is just.
It's crazy.
Insane. So there is no way we can supply the demand with natural raw honey without either feeding the bees sugar water or exploiting the bees too much. There is no way. We need to find new ways of like basically consume less, consume more ethically. This is the problem. The problem is we're consuming everything on the planet. It's like we're like
locusts.
Yeah, exactly. We're like destroying everything. So
honey needs to be more cherished and seen as something like very, very special, and
absolutely
not just a sort of endlessly bountiful product.
bees to thrive, gold must be paid for every hive. For when they're bought with other money, there'll be neither swarm nor honey. And when the first butterfly you see, oh, cut off his head across your knee and bury the head under a stone, and money will be your own. Let's keep a here when Grandpa goes, and straight away the bees must know. At once go down and tell the news, or his Pa and the bees will lose. Sent down to earth by Ra's own eyes to deliver the messages from the skies. Avoid this war when on its move, of God's work you may disapprove. Your bees to thrive, gold must be paid for every hive. For when exchanged for cash or pawn, there'll be neither corn nor swarm.
And your grandfather taught you to keep bees.
Correct.
How did he learn?
So his brothers and sisters owned land outside Damascus, which is in an area called Al-Ghuta. Al-Ghuta is like, it's the massive forest that feeds not only Damascus but like the cities around as well. Like it's so we grew up on going to the farm every weekend, and they like on the farms they had all kind of animals. Like it wasn't only keeping bees, so it was very traditional to have lambs, cows, goats, chickens, bees. So because people used to eat from the land, like that's what people grow their own food and they eat whatever the land is offering them.
Yeah, and I guess if you're living more like that, then you don't expect to be eating honey every day of the year.
Of course,
you just have it when it's available.
It's seasonal when the season is, and when the bees can afford to share more.
Yeah. Okay. And then you left. When did you leave Syria?
I left in the first time when I was 18, so a long time ago. I went to study in Spain. I spent like 4 years in Spain, 5 years in Spain, studying fashion design, and then I went back to Syria. Actually, no, so I left when I was 18, went to Spain, then I came to London for a year. I started a business, and then
fashion business
in the fashion industry, and then in 2011 the revolution in Syria happened, and I went back to Syria because we were all shocked that finally that someone dared to like chant anything against a dictatorship, because we have a bloody dictatorship, like a very, very aggressive war machine type of dictatorship. So when the revolution happened, I closed down our business here, and I went back to Syria because I wanted to be part of the revolution and like what was happening. Stayed there in 2011 and 12. Then things got really, really bad, and I was arrested a few times
for protesting,
for organizing protests, and eventually many of my friends were killed in either when they get arrested or they were either tortured and killed, or they were killed in the protests, like getting shot at the protests. Eventually, we had to run away, like we had to leave Syria in 2013. At the beginning of 2013, the army was like assaulting any neighborhood where the protests like happen. So they were like just bombarding the neighborhoods with like random missiles, like pushing bombs out of helicopters, like literally pushing barrel bombs, dropping them randomly on the neighborhoods. So eventually we had to like all leave, and I left in 2013. I went to Egypt for a year because I had a job offer from like a very big fashion brand there. Worked there for a year, and then the army in Egypt took over the government. There was a coup. They took over the government, and they started coordinating with the Syrian army, and they were arresting any Syrians who were wanted in Syria. So
you were wanted in Syria.
So I was arrested in Egypt, but luckily, because I worked for a very big company, the owner had connections with the Ministry of Defense, and they told him, we're gonna have to deport him. So, but instead of sending him to Syria, we're gonna send him somewhere else. So they sent me here in 2014, and I applied for asylum.
Okay, and you managed to get asylum.
It was quite easy for me, not to show off, but like I had so many documents to prove that my life is in danger if I go back to Syria.
Yeah.
I was arrested 3 times. I was tortured. My name was in the newspaper a few times because of the activities that we were doing, because we were doing so many peaceful activities against a very brutal dictatorship. And the media was picking up on these little things that were happening in Damascus and outside Damascus, because it was crazy what we were doing, to like literally in front of tanks and like armies, just bombarding the hell out of anyone who says anything. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. جنة 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 والله يا وطننا جنة 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 والله يا وطننا يا وطن يا حبيب يا تراب الطيب يا وطن يا حبيب يا تراب الطيب.
ودم ولادك والله ومشعل
غريبة الدنيا غريبة 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 يابا ديارنا صارت بعيدة 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 بلادك هجرتي
Wow. Okay, so you've been in England since 2014
2014, yeah.
and you got a job working in Harrods, is that right?
The first job I had was actually working for Vice, so the platform. In 2014, Vice started working on documentaries about the revolutions in the Arab Spring, like across the Arab world, and they were focusing on Syria. So I was working with them on editing and translating documentaries. So we were getting like footage from the war zones in Syria and like from different areas, and we were just making documentaries about what was happening. So that was the first year, and it was a very tough job because I was dealing with like really horrible, like heartbreaking footage of like massacres being done, like committed by the army, and I had to go through all this footage to understand what was happening and translate and edit. So that was the first year working with Vice, and then I got a job working in Harrods as in the luxury fashion industry. That was when.
That's a big contrast to what you were going through before that.
Yeah, but I needed money at that stage. I was desperate to get more money, especially that my family was also stuck on the road.
Are they still in Syria, your family?
No, they left. So when I left Egypt, they were with me in Egypt, but they also got kicked out. So they went to my sister in Dubai, and they stayed there until my other sister, who lives in the U.S., managed to get them a family reunion. Like they got like a green card basically.
To the US?
To the US.
Okay, so they're in the US now?
Yeah, they all left and went to the US, and I came here.
Yeah. Okay, wow.
See my dearie here in thine arms is cured. Lassie, lie near me.
Okay, so you were working in Harrods.
Started working in Harrods. I was hired as a Christmas stamp to work with Burberry, but I worked all my life in the fashion industry, so I had a really good experience in that field. However, because my experience was considered non-EU experience, it wasn't taken into consideration, and I had to start my career in the fashion industry from zero, like from Christmas stamp. Then in 2 months I was promoted to a full-time sales assistant. Then after a few months they promoted me to like a special advisor. Then I think I was the one, I think no one ever in the fashion industry or in Harrods was getting promoted like I was. Every year I was getting either headhunted by a different brand and with a higher position, or I was getting promoted in within the company. So every year I was jumping a position, a title.
That's amazing.
When usually people spend 3 to 4 years in every position. But that was due to the experience
Your
that I already had.
Yeah.
So yeah, I worked in Harrods for from then, since then until I quit my job and I started Bees and Refugees in 2020.
Okay, so what was it that really made you decide that you couldn't, or that you didn't want to be working in Harrods anymore, and that you wanted to start this project?
I mean, there were few different factors. The first one was the fact that I wasn't happy at work. I hated my work, literally. I was really...
You were really good at it, but you hated it.
But I hated it.
Yeah.
To me, it was, especially working and serving the 1% of the 1%.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And knowing that most of the money that they're bringing and they're using that they're wasting millions, that is money that is stolen from their countries, stolen from the people. And I hated that. I was always angry at work, and I always
Yeah, I can imagine.
So,
I think I'd be pretty angry working in Harrods too, to be honest.
Yeah, so
you did well to...
I lasted too long, and the reason why
that's pretty amazing to have lasted when you were struggling with it.
Yeah, the reason why I lasted is because I was supporting my family into their journey for them to get to the US, get them established.
Yeah.
We opened a small restaurant for them in the US so they can get busy and focus on their life. So it was, I literally, when I left my job it was few months after the restaurant of my parents broke even. So to me that was I got a bit of my freedom, and I could say, okay, so you don't need my money now, I can do something that maybe that will help me.
Yeah.
So I left, that's when I left Harrods.
Okay, and you spoke to your grandfather, and he suggested that you got a beehive.
That was before I left Harrods. So I was really struggling while I was working with Harrods, and that's when my grandfather said, oh, why don't you get a beehive and put it in your garden?
Yeah.
And
he was just sort of suggesting it as a hobby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then that was in 2019, and in 2020, literally January 2020, I quit my job, and I actually registered Bees and Refugees in October 2019, and then in January, when I realized that, okay, I either do this project or not, and I quit.
Okay, so you said that working with the bees was kind of supporting your mental health and kind of helping you to feel more hopeful and better. Yeah, was that specifically working with the bees and connecting with nature in that way and sort of slowing down?
Yeah, working with the bees brings you back to the moment, and you're so focused on the bees and how magnificent, how majestic, how I mean, the more you learn about them, the more you're fascinated with how they work and how they operate. It's fascinating. So working with the bees kind of breaks any connection that you have. You know, when you have a PTSD, or when you have an anxiety attack, especially the types of anxiety attacks that I get, they're very intense, and usually this happens when something triggers a memory, or whether it is you hear a sound for me, if there is firework, I could have a very bad anxiety attack, and so basically you have these attacks when something triggers you, and when you're working with the bees, it's impossible. There is nothing that can trigger anything. Like you're so
like
focused,
absorbed in their world.
exactly,
Yeah.
and you're so in that moment that you break any connection that you have with any trauma that you have. So at least for that time, you're just joyful, you're just in peace, and you're just focused on something completely different from anything that you've witnessed before. So
Yeah, almost like a meditation.
it
hey?
is.
And by just even making that space, where you feel peaceful, where you feel absorbed, slowly becoming familiar with those states of a more peaceful state of mind.
Yeah.
Will, I can imagine, be really healing and slowly.
It's a
sort of help you
slow
feel
process.
calmer. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what were the initial stages of setting up the organisation?
First thing, I got the support of my partner. We're not together anymore, but like I still owe her so much, and I appreciate that she was very supportive. So she kind of pushed me into the idea of crowdfunding, and she said she found the platform Space Hive, and we submitted, like, literally. She's so smart, and she knows how to write, and she was doing her PhD, so she helped me write a very nice description for the project.
Yeah.
We just submitted the project for crowdfunding on Space Hive, and the platform, they reached out, and we had a meeting, and they told me that we could get if I find a way to convince Hammersmith and Fulham Council to invest, they usually might chip in with like a big amount.
Yeah.
And I mean, at that stage I was literally emailing and telling, like, I was talking about the project day and night to everyone.
Yeah.
And just knocking on doors and seeing what, because I needed spaces for the bees, I needed money for the bee, I needed everything. I had nothing.
Yeah. This is what I was wondering as well, how you found all the places to store the bees and.
The places were basically me just dropping 50,000 emails to every potential site, that, like, schools, community gardens, forests, land trusts.
All
literally.
in this borough, or
all
like more
across London, everywhere across London.
Yeah.
So I was always, I've received 10,000 no's and maybe a couple of hundreds of, like, yes, let's discuss. So that's how it started. One of the people I emailed was the leader of Hammersmith and Fulham Council. His name is Councillor Stephen Cowan. So he's a Labour member. I was checking his name out as the leader, and I found a speech for him in 2012, I think, with him talking about welcoming refugees in Hammersmith and Fulham. So I dropped him an email saying, like, oh, so I saw your speech, and tell me what you're doing to welcome refugees. By the way, I have this idea. So he invited me to the council, and we had a meeting, and I told him all about the project, what I had in mind, which is exactly what happened. And he was, like, super excited about it. He was very on board. He called his cabinet, like everyone, like the cabinet of the council. They joined our meeting, and he was telling them about the project, and I was like, wow. So some people actually believe in it.
Yeah. That's amazing.
And then,
it is such a cool idea, this sort of like combining environmental and social activism. It's like really beautiful, and it's so cool that it's sort of thriving and just
it's
growing.
Great.
And
I mean, it is thriving and growing, but, like, I have to say it, in 2 years I haven't got paid a salary yet. Like, me and the collective work of so many volunteers, we're all doing this because we love it, and because it's bringing us good. We're making us feel good, and it's making other people feel good. But, like, in terms of money, it's
not
struggling.
Not doing
It's because we're also steering away from, like, exploiting the bees. So we're a beekeeping operation that's not exploiting the bees, so we're struggling a lot more.
Yeah, but you've got a lot of good karma. You're
Yeah.
rich in karma.
Yeah.
That's going
And
to keep you going for life. You
and
don't
hopefully,
need money.
hopefully, I mean, I survived so far because Universal Credit were giving me £1,200 a month, and now they stopped it.
Oh, really?
So now I have to like maybe find another job while doing this work as well. So it is challenging, and but we're pushing, like we're gonna do everything we can to get funding. Like knocking on every door.
Mm-hmm.
We have an amazing team of volunteers, and 3 of them are experts in fundraising.
Amazing.
And so they're writing up applications, and we're applying now.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get there.
You will, yeah. That's so
Yeah.
cool that you've got like 30 volunteers. Who are like supporting this project. That's
Yeah.
nuts.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's amazing. Yeah, because like for them as well, what we do is something fun. They learn a lot. They all become beekeepers.
Aw.
They're all getting like local raw honey. Like so they're
When
like-
it's in season.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're like, I think it's everyone is benefiting.
Yeah, and connecting to each other and making
Absolutely.
friends and spending time in
'Cause
nature. And
all these volunteers, we're all very similar. We all have very similar values,
Yeah.
ethics. We all share a lot. Like,
yeah,
Yeah, which is great.
Yeah, it is great, and it's nice to have something that actually attracts those kind of, people who actually care. And if you're an activist and you have real activist ideals, it's so nice when you actually connect with a network of people who really care about what you care about. It's really
100%.
empowering and
Yeah, 100%.
supportive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your sort of vision for the future of bees and refugees?
So when I was asked this question, I said that my vision for the next 5 years would be to hopefully get to support refugees in refugee camps, those who have been living in camps for like almost now 10 years.
This is the thing about refugee camps, like they're sort of, in theory, a temporary solution, but in reality I think the average stay of a person in a refugee camp is like 17 years.
Yeah, it's insane.
They're actually long-term cities almost.
Yeah. But I mean, they're like literally camps with tents that slowly within like 15 to 20 years they develop to become a refugee camp, but like with very bad infrastructure.
Yeah, because it's designed as a short-term settlement, but it turns into a long-term settlement. I think the oldest refugee camp, it was set up in 1948, and it's still...
Yeah, and like the Zatari refugee camp in Jordan, it's one of the oldest camps in the world. Like, it's been there and it's still there. It's like, people still live there. Even in like the Palestinian refugee camps in Syria, they're still, I mean, like they no longer exist because they were bombarded like hell by the regime after the revolution. But like people lived in these camps almost all their life. Like they were born there and they died there. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's crazy, this sort of design structure, of going into sort of crisis spaces and then setting up a temporary camp model that has none of the infrastructure. It should be planned for a long-term and sort of a sustainable long-term supportive space that can actually help rehabilitate refugees.
Yeah, and what it does, it actually breaks them even further.
Yeah.
It breaks their identity, it breaks their culture, and it's just, it's a horrible place. That's why our aim is to support people who are stuck in these camps with beekeeping and food growing projects.
Yeah.
So because beekeeping goes really nicely with permaculture and like growing food. So and again, not again, I haven't mentioned this before yet.
Not to me.
But like it's a very important point, which is how can we fight capitalism by growing our own food? This is like step one, breaking down these supply chains that are causing so much harm to the planet. So we want to support refugees in camps by supporting them with like beekeeping projects and creating farms basically where they work, because working there will offer them kind of some sort of therapy, and they will produce their own food as well. We already have partnerships with organizations in the northern part of Syria where the liberated parts, which is like not the regime controlled areas, because we cannot even access the regime controlled areas.
Is that mainly in the south?
Idlib, north.
The regime controlled is in the south.
South and the coast of the Mediterranean.
Okay.
The more like it's a city called Idlib. So the city of Idlib is still an opposition held area, which is it's where we have a partnership now with an organization. Now we're setting up, we're like literally having meetings almost every week to have all the sort all the logistics, and we're gonna start the project in 2023, like in the spring of 2023.
Wow. So what will that involve? You'll get beehives from
there, from the local, from Syria. We have connections with Syrian beekeepers. They're gonna supply the bees to a piece of land that we're gonna rent, and we're gonna just put up so many raised beds like this, and bees and raised beds. Very simple.
Okay. Like near to the camps that are there already.
Yeah. With in somewhere we're gonna like find the land with an easy access to the camps, like where people can just like walk back and forth.
Nice. Wow, that's amazing. That's so
hopefully
cool.
we'll get there.
You will. That sounds great. Okay, so that's in the camps, and then in London, how do you see your project growing here?
So in London, we were always after a base where we can grow our operation sustainably.
Yeah.
So for the past 2 years, we've had a network of beehives scattered everywhere. And managing those beehives was very challenging because they're everywhere in terms of like they were time consuming, and our carbon footprint was like up the roof because we had to travel so much from like so many different sites. So what we're doing now is we finally now have the base, which we thought that was something we're going to achieve in 2 years also, but we've achieved it now.
Wow.
So now we have a farm in Kent, we have a base in Kent.
Oh my god, amazing.
We just got it last week,
Congratulations,
Thank
that's
you.
huge.
It's we're applying for one of the funding grants that we're applying for is to renovate and fix up this farm, because it's an abandoned farm since the World War II. It's like it's a beautiful farm, but it's kind of abandoned.
Yeah.
We're gonna fix it up. We're gonna fix a couple of the farm buildings, make one similar to this one. So one we're gonna use for workshops, and the other one we're gonna use for carpentry and building hives and for like the beekeeping operation basically. That base will be our main base, and then we're gonna keep bees in sites like Oasis Farm, where we're hosting groups as well.
Okay.
Because like this is so easy, it's a very easy access for groups in London.
Yeah.
And that the farm in Kent could be the base for other groups who are like resettled in boroughs outside London.
When I first came to town, they called me the Roving Jewel. Now they've changed their tune, call me Katie Crew. Through the woods I'm going, through the boggy mire, straight way down the road till I come to my heart's desire. If I was where I would be, then I'd be where I am not. Here I am where I must be, where I would be I cannot. When I first came to town, they bought me drinks aplenty. Now they've changed their tune and hand me the bottles empty. If I was where I would be, then I'd be where I am not. Here I am where I must be, where I would be I cannot.
State monopolisation of modern movement materialises in border controls that limit movement between states through mechanisms of right restrictions which are rooted in political history. Hannah Arendt's 1951 exploration of the intimate relationship between the rise of the nation-state and the decline of the rights of man critiqued the supposed universality of the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, suggesting that the loss of the security blanket of citizenship results in a person's alienation from their rights. At birth, one becomes the bearer of sovereignty, a process originating in ancient Rome that equated citizenship as the sum of the soil one is born upon. Accordingly, the refugee, separated from the birthright of sovereignty, becomes an anomaly who departs from the order of the nation-state. This impure element necessitates state intervention and subsequent control, which acts not directly or immediately on mobilised people, but instead it acts upon their actions through the production of illegality. The European Union functions as a supranational state formation, producing illegality through restricting movement according to a hierarchical system of rights, shaped by post-colonial histories. The redrawing of the colonial boundary through a politics of bounding imbues the rights of supranational sovereignty upon those that fit within EU-ascribed safe categories of origin, that are continually in flux due to their dependence upon political alliances. The wall around the West enforces a global apartheid, whereby lenient restrictions are placed upon the movement of citizens whose countries now reap the harvest of wealth and power from centuries of imperial exploitation and subjugation. Simultaneously, racialised notions of difference, deployed for the colonial justification of power, have been reshaped in neo-colonial systems that frame the mobilised subject as a threat to security and strict border controls as the only solution. Despite the domination of transnational institutions and the mobility of capital in the modern globalised context, the legacy of the European mission to exploit the New World in the 15th century has shaped today's power relations and racial ideologies. The racialised rhetoric of security, fundamental to the operation of border controls, obscures the individual subjectivities of actors operating within the field of the migration crisis. The state's justification of human rights abuses is supported by a xenophobic rhetoric, framing the mobilised person as a threatening migrant other. As Frantz Fanon wrote in 1957, the power relations inherent in the process of ascription deprives the ascribed of possible alternative identifications, leading Alana Feldman to suggest that today's refugee crisis could be seen as another moment in the anti-colonial struggle, as border controls pave a speedy and secure passage for some, but a slow and deadly passage for Europe's unwanted. Numerous incidents illustrate the destructive and inadequate application of laws abused by the actors in border policing, including the death of 1,500 mobilised people crossing the Mediterranean whilst fleeing Libya in 2011, the deadliest year since the UNHCR began recording statistics in 2006, and the 14,000 deaths documented at maritime borders over the last 20 years. The European deathscape, as de Genova called it, is swallowing countless lives, triggering a strategically deployed status of crisis as justification for strengthening impasses on the European scale. The use of the word crisis suggests an exception to the existing order. However, the refugee situation has not returned but persisted. To avoid presentism, it must be acknowledged that the numbers which constitute the current migration crisis are greater than the several waves of mass displacement in the Middle East during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and the further mass displacement in Europe during World War I and World War II that preceded it. However, throughout history, various influxes of populations have been mobilised due to poverty, conflict, population growth, and the irrepressible desire of individuals for economic advancement, welcomed as exploitable subjects in the domain of low-waged labour. Crisis is articulated through particular racialised politics. A central aspect to the theorisation of crisis, contributed by both Stuart Hall's exploration of structural racism and Antonio Gramsci's understanding of fascism and crisis, reveals the ways that race can function as a key lens through which crisis is experienced. Ideological constructions of race, crime and youth become articulated through ideological constructions appropriated by governments in office, the repressive apparatus of the state, and the media as an interlocking set of planned conspiracies. Set against the European way of life, this has inspired an upsurge in far-right xenophobic movements. This tactical rhetoric of crisis has enabled the reconfiguration, reinvigoration and recalibration of border policing and immigration and asylum law enforcement, which draws on the criminalisation of migration, consisting of all the discourses, facts and practices made by the police, judicial authorities, but also local governments, media and a part of the population that hold immigrants as responsible for a large share of criminal offences in order to justify blatant disregard for human rights. This increase of criminalisation of migration management does not correlate with a decrease in crime rates among mobilised populations, but rather with the extent that non-citizens are considered threatening, a process intensified during economic and social crisis and structural upheaval. As with criminal law, immigration legislation deploys the border tactics of detention, deportation centres replacing prisons. The detention tactic is a recent phenomenon. Arjen Leekers and Dennis Broder note that until the 1990s, permanent detention centres were not in operation in Britain. Over the following decade, detained populations increased from 250 in 1993 to 2,260 in 2003, a trend mirrored across Europe. Whilst the trend in the global south is to contain mobilised populations in refugee camps, in the global north refugees are dealt with case by case in detention centres, resulting in long periods of captivity as detainees attempt to navigate the legal processes of liberating their movement. Laura Muccielli and Sophie Nevenon's 2011 examination of border control tactics in the US, UK, France, Germany and Italy revealed that glowing detention populations and longer periods of confinement, twinned with governments' increasing efforts to expand detention capacity, to be common amongst each state's immigration policy. Lilina Cornelesi suggests that detention centres serve to deter future migrants and remove those already on national territory as rapidly and effectively as possible. The paradox central to the European detention systems is the low numbers of detainees who are actually expelled from the nations which detain them. The economic expense of detaining mobilised populations, along with the trauma inherent in this process, has led many to question the purpose of the strict border control detention apparatus, which does not serve the usual justifications of custody, namely rehabilitation, deterrence or punishment. Detention fails to enact its intended function, namely the discouragement of irregular residence among mobilised populations, as the growth in detention practices does not result in the fall in numbers of new irregular migrations. Scholars investigating the myriads of uses of detention centres reveal that their use to hide subaltern populations, including mobilised persons, drug addicts and homeless, during public festivities. Detention apparatus also acts as an antidote to popular anxiety through the symbolic assertion of state power. The irregular migrant is detained, acquiring status as one classified as dangerous. Detainees struggle to access legal help, prohibiting any contestation of these imposed classifications. However, a lack of empirical evidence exploring human rights abuses beyond the basic deprivation of liberty inherent in detention apparatus is lacking, limiting discussions of human rights abuses within EU detention centres. Restrictive strategies such as increased patrols at national frontiers do not deter, but rather they increase illegal movement, casting shadows on the rationality of border controls. Considering the limited benefits, the many-headed hydra of immigration policy deploys alternative methods to address the external penetration of borders through targeting internal mechanisms. Aiming for impenetrability, border controls are perpetually reinforced through legislation of restriction on conditions of entry and the bolstering of capacities of deportation and detention through increasing the allocation of resources of secure identification systems and linkages to broader strategies of pan-state control systems. This includes the externalisation of border controls through European neighbourhood policies. The programme of regulation is thus delegated to non-European states, such as Libya and Morocco, where sub-Saharan immigrants are confined in formal and informal camps, preventing them from crossing the seas to Europe. This results in undocumented, mobilised people detained in European states to desperately protest deportation through hunger strikes and self-mutilations. What constitutes better border controls in the eyes of the nation-state is rarely in line with the needs and wants of mobilised populations. Instead, borders are sites of state violence, in some cases self-inflicted in protests of detention and deportation. In others, officials enforcing street-level bureaucracy carry out orders of their governments, and borders become lungs choked on tear gas, noses smashed by border enforcement agents' truncheons and bullet wounds. This was the case in Hungary in 2015, when then Prime Minister Viktor Orban justified the use of live ammunition against mobilised people to defend Europe's Christian roots against what he called a Muslim menace. This racialisation of the migrant other as justification for brutal rights abuses reveals the entanglement of borders within a global post-colonial racial politic, which redraws the proverbial colour line and refortifies Europeanness as a racial formation of whiteness through government's deployment of language which seeps into popular discourse. Following the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris in 2015, the EU vowed to tighter border controls in defence against terrorist infiltration, despite the culprits of the Hebdo attack being racialised minority Europeans. Following a series of sexual attacks in Cologne, media discourse ensued concerning the inextricable cultural differences which shaped European encounters with mobilised populations in their host countries, apparently lacking in the European norms of civility and moral decency. The mobilised person's subjectivity is deemed inferior and unsavoury through a political rhetoric that associates borders with the maintenance of European social order. These discourses construct mobilised people in binary contradictory terms. On the one hand as the vulnerable in need of protection, on the other hand as deportable predators. Non-state actors in Britain are commonly known as smugglers, a word harking back to a time when Britain's economy was threatened by pirates, vagrants and smugglers at sea, that ignites a national sentiment of state as protector. The tragic irony is that the state acts to protect mobilised smuggled people from the laws that they have made. If immigration legislation granted the right of mobility to all people, then dangerous border crossings would not necessitate state intervention. As they are, border controls channel illegalised human mobility into ever more perilous pathways. Illustrated in July 2015 in the Calais mobilised people's camp, The Jungle. Thousands attempted to pass through Eurotunnel barriers and board transport headed to Britain when port workers were taking strike action, which later justified aggressive forms of border controls to protect Britain against what the then Prime Minister David Cameron termed a migrant swarm. The power of border controls originates not from one source, but multiple. Dehumanising and inflammatory discursive practice is one of the elements of the governmentality of migration, which consists of all procedures, institutions, populations and reflections that hold mobilised populations as the object. According to Fasan, it is a biopolitics of otherness, perpetuated by politicians propelling notions of the nation-state as paternalistic protector to garner political support. This racialised rhetoric is embroiled in popular media discourse. This employs a Gramscian common sense, attributing the responsibility of all major problems in European societies to subaltern mobilised populations. Headline-hungry media corporations create demand, whereby politicians are required to supply a rhetoric of plans, strategies and solutions. This constant production of new strategies renders the merit of old strategies a rarity. Perhaps if the long-term development of racialised government policy was reflected upon more frequently, it would be concluded that current border controls have created the migration crisis for which they claim to provide solutions. The state situates itself responsible for the management and deportation of undesirable, illegalised and deportable mobilised people in a stance that is wholly unreflexive. This is a crisis of politics in response to mass movement and should not be one for which a solution is defined in terms of border control and management. It is a political crisis of control over the ostensible borders of Europe, which lays bare the inherent inequality that constitutes the global system, but no realm of power is without the means of possible escape. Solidarity without borders movements offer an alternative, workable reality that bypasses the discriminatory practices of the governmentality of immigration, creating space where it can be reconfigured in what Foucault called heterotopias of deviation that destabilise sovereign domination, spaces of resistance uniting multiple actors who become architects of new political subjectivities and collective identities. Drawing on Gramscian political theory, the movements are committed to ensuring people understand their political and cultural contexts in order to engage with and challenge them. On the 12th of September 2015, emerging solidarity movements across 85 cities in 30 countries saw hundreds of thousands of people take to the street, marching under the slogan "Refugees Welcome." The 2015 movement was not just from below, it was also political, with leaders such as the Mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, supporting the creation of a network of refugee cities open to supporting mobilised population settlement, and then David Cameron bowing to mounting pressure and accepting an extra 100,000 refugees in the UK in 2015, whilst Angela Merkel suspended asylum law, allowing tens of thousands of refugees stranded in Hungary into Germany. Taking inspiration from Gramsci's observance that in order to challenge the hegemonic order enabled by consensuality that implements restrictive and exclusionary immigration and integration policies, alliances must be solidified within civil society between those whose class, economic or ethnic backgrounds are traditionally disparate, avoiding particularism in order to redefine political subjectivities in defence of the common. One such example is the No One is Illegal movement, an activist network which originated in Germany, advocating globalised political resistance in support of undocumented mobilised people. No One is Illegal works in solidarity with the sans-papiers and counteracts their loss of political agency through advocating their adoption of political subjectivity that confronts and resists the dominating power of sovereign state agencies that attempt to marginalise and silence acts of contestation. The movement mobilises a politics of discomfort, in critique of the governmentality of documentation, which implements a resisting strategy based on self-inquiry, anger and responsibility, rendering visible the inequalities of the nation-state's treatment of immigration through staging protests, such as those in 2017 held at airports against airlines employed by the German state to deport migrants, which involved both physical occupation of the space and also supporting the deportees' political subjectivities through educating them on how to protest within the plane. To deal with the crisis of migration, we need better border controls, which necessitates better political systems that would not ascribe the right to move according to racialised ideologies, that would not seek to justify abhorrent human rights abuses through the xenophobic rhetoric of protection. Another world is possible. It requires the bearers of sovereignty to flex the muscle of the imagination and envision a world without borders, to break from indoctrinated behaviours towards mobilised populations through acts of solidarity.